The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of London as Sergeant Thomas Mitchell adjusted his crisp red uniform. He had served in the Queen's Guard for 15 years, standing watch at Buckingham Palace through countless ceremonies and state functions. Today was different. Today he wasn't on duty at the palace gates. Instead, he was preparing to attend the funeral of General Sir Henry Worthington, a man who had changed the course of his life. Thomas remembered the first time he met the general. It was during a military exercise in Scotland, where young soldiers were being tested for their readiness to join elite units. Thomas was just 22 then, fresh from basic training and eager to prove himself. The general had been observing the exercises, his weathered face stern but his eyes kind. When Thomas completed a particularly challenging obstacle course in record time, the general had approached him personally. "Son, I see potential in you," the general had said, his voice carrying the authority of decades in service. "But potential means nothing without character. Show me your character, and I'll show you a future worth fighting for." Those words had stayed with Thomas through every challenge that followed. The general became his mentor, guiding him through the rigorous selection process for the Queen's Guard. When Thomas struggled with the ceremonial drill requirements, the general spent his own free time teaching him. When Thomas doubted his abilities during the psychological evaluations, the general reminded him of his strength. The funeral was being held at Westminster Cathedral, a grand ceremony befitting a decorated war hero. General Worthington had served in 3 conflicts, earned numerous medals, and had been instrumental in modernizing military training protocols. His death at 84 had prompted tributes from across the Commonwealth, and dignitaries from around the world were expected to attend. Thomas had received word of the general's passing through official military channels. The announcement included details about the funeral arrangements, noting that it would be a state funeral with full military honors. What struck Thomas most was learning about the general's final wishes. According to his family, the general had specifically requested that the soldiers he had mentored over the years be invited to attend, regardless of their current rank or position. As Thomas walked through the quiet streets toward Westminster, he reflected on how the general had shaped not just his military career, but his entire outlook on life. The general had taught him that true strength came from serving others, that honor was earned through daily actions, not grand gestures. He had shown Thomas that leadership meant lifting others up, not standing above them. The cathedral came into view, its magnificent spires reaching toward the cloudy London sky. Already crowds were gathering. Thomas could see military personnel in various uniforms, government officials in dark suits, and members of the public who had come to pay their respects. The general had been beloved not just by his fellow soldiers, but by the communities where he had served. Thomas approached the main entrance, where a group of officials in ceremonial dress were checking invitations and credentials. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the official invitation that had arrived at his barracks 3 days earlier. The envelope had been addressed to Sergeant Thomas Mitchell, Queen's Guard, and bore the official seal of the Ministry of Defense. The invitation itself was printed on heavy cream paper with gold lettering. It read, "You are cordially invited to attend the state funeral of General Sir Henry Worthington, Victoria Cross in recognition of your service and the special mentorship relationship you shared with the deceased. Westminster Cathedral, 11 a.m. Thomas felt a mix of pride and sorrow as he held the invitation. Pride because the general's family had remembered him, had thought to include him in this final farewell. Sorrow because he would never again hear the general's wise counsel or see his encouraging smile. The man who had believed in him when he barely believed in himself was gone. As he joined the queue of mourners waiting to enter the cathedral, Thomas noticed the incredible diversity of people who had come to honor the general. There were elderly veterans leaning on walking sticks, their chests decorated with faded medals. Young soldiers stood at attention, their uniforms pressed to perfection. Civilians who had known the general in various capacities spoke in hushed tones about his kindness and dedication. The queue moved slowly but steadily toward the entrance. Thomas could hear the distant sound of military bands tuning their instruments, preparing for the ceremonial procession that would follow the service. The weight of the moment settled on him as he realized he was about to be part of history, witnessing the final tribute to a true military legend. Behind him in the queue, Two young officers were discussing the general's legacy. One mentioned how the general had revolutionized training methods, making them more humane while maintaining their effectiveness. The other spoke about the general's charity work, how he had established funds to help military families in need. Thomas smiled slightly, knowing these were just small glimpses of the man's true character. The morning air was crisp and carried the scent of the flowers that lined the cathedral steps. Massive wreaths from military units, government departments, and international allies created a colorful display of respect and remembrance. Thomas noticed one wreath in particular, smaller than the others but positioned prominently. The card read, "From the soldiers you believed in when no one else would." As Thomas drew closer to the entrance, he could see the meticulous organization that had gone into planning the ceremony. Security personnel moved discreetly through the crowd, while ushers in formal attire guided mourners toward appropriate entrances based on their invitations. Military protocol was being followed precisely, just as the general would have expected. Thomas reached the entrance checkpoint, where a stern-looking official in a dark suit examined each invitation carefully before allowing mourners to proceed. The man's badge identified him as Protocol Officer James Harrison from the Ministry of Defense. Officer Harrison had been managing state ceremonies for over 20 years and took his responsibilities very seriously. When Thomas presented his invitation, Officer Harrison studied it with unusual intensity. He turned the paper over, examining the seal and watermark. His brow furrowed as he compared the invitation to a list on his clipboard. After a long moment, he looked up at Thomas with a skeptical expression. "I'm sorry, Sergeant, but there seems to be an issue with your invitation," Harrison said in a clipped, official tone. "This doesn't match the format we've been using for verified attendees." Thomas felt his stomach drop. "Sir, I received this invitation through official military channels. It came directly to my barracks with the ministry seal." Harrison shook his head, pointing to subtle differences in the paper quality and formatting. "I understand your confusion, but we've had issues with counterfeit invitations for high-profile ceremonies. This appears to be one of them. The font is slightly different, and the paper stock isn't what we use for official state functions." Other mourners began to gather behind Thomas, creating a small crowd at the checkpoint. Whispers started to spread as people realized there was some kind of problem. Thomas felt his face flush with embarrassment and confusion. How could his invitation be fake when it had come through proper military channels? "Sir, please, you must understand," Thomas said, his voice strained with emotion. "General Worthington was my mentor. He personally recommended me for the Queen's Guard. I've served with honor for 15 years. There must be some mistake." Harrison's expression remained unmoved. "I'm sure you're a fine soldier, Sergeant Mitchell, but I cannot allow entry based on what appears to be a fraudulent document. If you have other credentials or can contact someone who can verify your invitation, we can reconsider." Thomas searched through his pockets, hoping to find some other form of identification that might help his case. He pulled out his military identification, his service record summary, and even a photograph of himself with the general taken during a regimental ceremony 5 years earlier. "Look at this photo, sir," Thomas pleaded. "This proves I knew the general personally. We served together. He would have wanted me here." Harrison glanced at the photograph but remained firm. "Personal photographs can be obtained through various means, Sergeant. I'm not questioning your service or your relationship with the general. I'm simply following protocol regarding invitation authenticity." The queue behind Thomas was growing longer, and other officials began to take notice of the commotion. A senior usher approached Harrison and whispered something in his ear. Harrison nodded and turned back to Thomas. "Sergeant Mitchell, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside. We cannot delay the entry process for other mourners while we resolve this matter. If you can produce proper documentation, you may return to the queue." Thomas felt devastated. The one person who could have vouched for him was lying in the cathedral, and the invitation he had believed to be genuine was being questioned. He stepped out of the line, watching as other mourners passed by, many of whom he noticed were carrying invitations that looked identical to his own. Standing off to the side, Thomas observed the continuing stream of attendees. He saw military officers of various ranks, government officials, foreign dignitaries, and what appeared to be ordinary citizens who had somehow earned the right to attend this prestigious ceremony. Each person presented their invitation, and was waved through without incident. A group of young soldiers approached the checkpoint, and Thomas noticed they were carrying invitations that appeared identical to his. They were processed quickly and allowed to enter without question. This only deepened Thomas's confusion and frustration. If their invitations were genuine and looked exactly like his, why was his being questioned? Thomas approached a different official stationed nearby, hoping for a second opinion. This person, identified as Assistant Protocol Officer Sarah Chen, listened patiently as Thomas explained his situation. "I understand your frustration, Sergeant," Officer Chen said sympathetically. "Unfortunately, Officer Harrison is the senior protocol official for this event. His decision stands unless overruled by someone with higher authority." "Who would have that authority?" Thomas asked desperately. "Well, someone from the general's family, a senior military official, or someone from the royal household could potentially override the decision. But given that the ceremony begins in less than 30 minutes, finding such a person would be quite difficult." Thomas thanked Officer Chen and stepped back to consider his options. He could see media crews setting up their equipment, preparing to broadcast the funeral to the nation. Military bands were taking their positions for the ceremonial procession. Inside the cathedral, he could hear the organ playing softly as early arrivals took their seats. The thought of missing the general's funeral was unbearable. This man had shaped his entire military career, had believed in him when others doubted, had taken personal time to ensure Thomas succeeded in his goals. The general had often spoken about loyalty and dedication, about never giving up when faced with obstacles. Thomas decided to try a different approach. He walked around the cathedral, looking for alternative entrances or perhaps a less strict checkpoint. However, security was tight throughout the area. Every entrance was monitored, and officials were checking credentials at each point. As he circled back toward the main entrance, Thomas noticed an elderly man in a military uniform struggling with his walking stick while trying to present his invitation. The man appeared to be a veteran, his chest decorated with numerous medals, including what looked like campaign medals from World War II. Thomas immediately went to assist the elderly veteran, helping him maintain his balance while he sorted through his papers. The old soldier looked up at Thomas with grateful eyes. "Thank you, son," he said in a shaky but warm voice. "These old hands don't work as well as they used to." "Are you here for the general's funeral as well?" "Yes, sir, I am," Thomas replied. "Or at least I'm trying to be. Having some trouble with my invitation." The elderly veteran studied Thomas's uniform and bearing with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades in military service. "Queen's Guard, I see. Fine unit. The general spoke highly of the Guard whenever I saw him at veteran gatherings." The elderly veteran, who introduced himself as Colonel William Davies, listened carefully as Thomas explained his predicament. The colonel's eyes showed understanding and sympathy as Thomas described his relationship with the general and the current situation with his invitation. "That's quite troubling," Sergeant Colonel Davies said, adjusting his military cap. "I knew Henry well. We served together in Cyprus back in the 70s. He often talked about the young soldiers he was mentoring, particularly those in the ceremonial units. He believed that soldiers in prestigious positions like the Queen's Guard carried extra responsibility to represent the finest traditions of military service." Thomas felt a glimmer of hope as the colonel continued speaking. Here was someone who had known the general personally and might be able to help him gain entry to the funeral. "Colonel, do you think you might be able to speak to the protocol officers on my behalf?" Thomas asked respectfully. "I understand their need for security, but I genuinely believe there's been some kind of administrative error." Colonel Davies nodded thoughtfully. "I can certainly try, son. Let me see what influence an old soldier might still have." They approached Officer Harrison together, with Colonel Davies introducing himself and explaining the situation. The colonel's numerous medals and distinguished bearing commanded immediate respect from the protocol officer. "Officer Harrison," the colonel began in his authoritative voice, "I've known General Worthington for over 40 years, and I can personally vouch for this young man's character and his connection to the deceased. Surely there must be some accommodation that can be made." Harrison listened respectfully but remained firm in his position. "Colonel Davies, I have tremendous respect for your service and your word. However, I'm bound by strict security protocols. Without proper documentation, I cannot make exceptions, regardless of personal recommendations." The colonel's expression showed disappointment but also understanding of the bureaucratic constraints. I appreciate your position, Officer Harrison, though I believe you're making an error in this particular case. As they stepped away from the checkpoint, Thomas felt his hopes fading again. Even the intervention of a distinguished colonel hadn't been enough to overcome the protocol requirements. The ceremony was due to begin in just 20 minutes, and Thomas could see officials beginning to close off certain entrances as they prepared for the formal proceedings. "Don't give up yet, son," Colonel Davies said, patting Thomas on the shoulder. "There's someone else here who might be able to help. I saw Field Marshal Sir Robert Blackwood arrive about 10 minutes ago. If anyone has the authority to override these protocol decisions, it would be him." Thomas's eyes widened at the mention of Field Marshal Blackwood. The Field Marshal was a living legend in the British military, having served with distinction in numerous conflicts and currently holding one of the highest positions in the army hierarchy. He was also known for his fairness and his support of ordinary soldiers. "Do you think he would listen to our situation?" Thomas asked. "Robert Blackwood has never forgotten what it's like to be a regular soldier," the colonel replied. "He started as an enlisted man himself, worked his way up through the ranks. If anyone would understand the importance of honoring a mentor's memory, it would be him." They began searching for the field marshal among the crowd of distinguished attendees. The task seemed daunting as hundreds of people in formal attire and military uniforms moved about the cathedral grounds. Time was running short, and Thomas began to worry that even if they found the field marshal, it might be too late to gain entry. Near the VIP entrance, Colonel Davies spotted a group of senior military officials engaged in conversation. Among them stood a tall, dignified man in an immaculately tailored uniform with the distinctive insignia of a field marshal. His bearing was unmistakably that of someone accustomed to command, yet his demeanor appeared approachable. "There he is," the colonel whispered to Thomas. "Field Marshal Blackwood." As they approached the group, Thomas felt nervous about interrupting such high-ranking officials. The field marshal was discussing arrangements for the ceremonial guard of honor with several other officers. Their conversation focused on ensuring every detail of the ceremony met the standards the general would have expected. Colonel Davies waited for a pause in the conversation before stepping forward. "Field Marshal Blackwood, if I may have a word with you, sir. I'm Colonel William Davies, retired. I served with General Worthington in Cyprus." The field marshal turned toward them with a warm smile. "Of course, Colonel Davies. I remember Henry mentioning you on several occasions. He spoke very highly of your service together." "Thank you, sir. I'm here with Sergeant Thomas Mitchell from the Queen's Guard, who finds himself in a rather unfortunate situation regarding his invitation to the ceremony." The field marshal's attention shifted to Thomas, and his experienced eyes quickly assessed the young soldier's bearing, uniform, and obvious distress. "What seems to be the problem, Sergeant?" Thomas stood at attention and explained his situation clearly and concisely, just as his military training had taught him. He described his relationship with the general, the invitation he had received, and the protocol officer's concerns about its authenticity. Field Marshal Blackwood listened intently, occasionally nodding as Thomas spoke. When Thomas finished his account, the field marshal asked to see the disputed invitation. He examined it carefully, comparing it to his own invitation and noting the subtle differences that had concerned Officer Harrison. "This is indeed puzzling," the field marshal said thoughtfully. "The content appears legitimate, and your account of your relationship with General Worthington rings true. Henry often spoke about his mentorship activities, particularly his work with soldiers in ceremonial units." Thomas felt encouraged by the field marshal's response, but tried not to get his hopes up too high. He had already experienced disappointment when the colonel's intervention hadn't been sufficient. "Sir, I understand if nothing can be done," Thomas said respectfully. "I just wanted to honor the general's memory and say goodbye to the man who shaped my military career." The field marshal studied Thomas for a moment longer, then glanced at his watch. The ceremony was scheduled to begin in less than 15 minutes, and the final preparations were underway. Military bands had taken their positions, and the last few mourners were being processed through the checkpoints. Field Marshal Blackwood straightened his shoulders and made a decision that would change the entire course of the situation. "Sergeant Mitchell, I want you to come with me. Colonel Davies, you as well." The field marshal walked purposefully toward the main entrance where Officer Harrison was stationed. The crowd of officials and mourners naturally parted as they saw the senior military leader approaching. Thomas followed closely behind, his heart racing with a mixture of hope and anxiety. "Officer Harrison," the field marshal called out in his commanding voice. "I need to speak with you immediately." Harrison looked up from checking another mourner's credentials and immediately recognized the field marshal. He snapped to attention, clearly aware that he was in the presence of one of the most senior military officers in the United Kingdom. "Yes, sir, Field Marshal. How may I assist you?" Harrison responded with obvious respect and perhaps a hint of nervousness. "I understand you've been having concerns about this soldier's invitation," the Field Marshal said, indicating Thomas. "I want to tell you something about General Worthington and the kind of man he was." The Field Marshal's voice carried the weight of years of experience and command authority. Other officials and nearby mourners began to pay attention to the conversation, sensing that something significant was happening. General Worthington believed that military service was about more than following orders and completing missions. The Field Marshal continued. He believed it was about developing character, building relationships, and creating a brotherhood that lasted beyond active duty. "This sergeant represents everything the general valued in a soldier." Harrison listened respectfully, but still appeared conflicted about his protocol responsibilities. "Sir, I have tremendous respect for your judgment, but my instructions regarding invitation verification are quite specific." "Your instructions," the Field Marshal said firmly, "are to ensure that only authorized personnel attend this ceremony. I am personally authorizing Sergeant Mitchell's attendance. As the senior military representative at this event, I have the authority to make that determination." The Field Marshal then did something unexpected. He removed his own invitation from his jacket pocket and handed it to Thomas. "Sergeant, you will enter this cathedral using my invitation. I will arrange alternative entry through military channels." Thomas was stunned by this generous gesture. "Sir, I cannot accept this. This is your invitation to attend the ceremony." "Son," the Field Marshal said with a gentle but firm tone, "General Worthington would want you here more than he would want me here. You were his protege, his success story. I am simply another old soldier paying his respects. Your presence here honors his memory in a way that mine cannot." Officer Harrison looked uncertain about this unusual arrangement. The protocol manual likely didn't cover situations where senior military officials gave away their invitations to junior personnel. Colonel Davies stepped forward to support the Field Marshal's decision. "Officer Harrison, I believe what we're witnessing here is exactly the kind of leadership and sacrifice that General Worthington exemplified throughout his career. The Field Marshal is demonstrating the values that made our military great." Other mourners who had overheard the conversation began to murmur their agreement. Several veterans nodded approvingly, recognizing the significance of the Field Marshal's gesture. A few civilian mourners seemed moved by the display of military brotherhood and honor. The Field Marshal addressed the growing audience around them. "Ladies and gentlemen, General Worthington spent his career nurturing young soldiers, helping them become better people and better servants of their country. This sergeant represents the success of that mission. His presence here today is not just appropriate, it is essential." Harrison finally nodded his acceptance. "Very well, sir. Sergeant Mitchell, you may enter using the Field Marshal's invitation." Thomas felt overwhelmed with gratitude and emotion. "Field Marshal, I don't know how to thank you for this kindness." "Thank me by living up to the standards General Worthington set for you," the Field Marshal replied. "Honor his memory through your continued service and character." As Thomas prepared to enter the cathedral, Colonel Davies approached him one final time. "Son, when you're sitting in that cathedral, remember that you're not just representing yourself. You're representing every soldier the general ever mentored, every young person he believed in when others didn't." The organ music inside the cathedral grew louder, signaling that the ceremony was about to begin. Thomas shook hands with both the Field Marshal and the Colonel, thanking them for their support and intervention. As he walked toward the cathedral entrance, he felt the weight of responsibility to represent not just his own grief and gratitude, but the appreciation of all the soldiers whose lives had been touched by the general's mentorship. Inside the cathedral, the atmosphere was solemn and magnificent. Hundreds of mourners filled the ancient pews, their quiet conversations creating a respectful murmur that echoed off the stone walls. Military personnel in dress uniforms sat alongside government officials in formal attire. The diversity of attendees spoke to the broad impact of the general's life and career. Thomas found a seat among other military personnel, many of whom he recognized from various ceremonies and events over the years. Some nodded to him in recognition, while others simply acknowledged his presence with the subtle respect that existed among soldiers. The cathedral's architecture seemed to amplify the solemnity of the occasion. Massive columns reached toward the vaulted ceiling, while stained glass windows cast colorful patterns on the assembled mourners. At the front of the cathedral, the general's casket was positioned on a platform draped with military colors and surrounded by an honor guard from various units. As Thomas settled into his seat, he reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had brought him here, from the initial rejection at the checkpoint, to the intervention of Colonel Davies, and finally the remarkable gesture by Field Marshal Blackwood. The morning had been a testament to the values the general had always preached: honor, loyalty, and looking after fellow soldiers. The military bands outside began to play, their music carrying through the cathedral's heavy doors. Soon the formal procession would begin, and Thomas would finally have the opportunity to pay his respects to the man who had changed his life. The funeral ceremony began with the traditional military precision that General Worthington had always admired. The organ fell silent as the honor guard, composed of soldiers from various regiments the general had served with, marched slowly down the cathedral's center aisle. Their synchronized steps echoed through the vast space, creating a rhythm that seemed to match the beating hearts of everyone present. Thomas watched with deep respect as the color party presented the regimental flags and battle standards associated with the general's long career. Each flag told a story of service, sacrifice, and honor, values that the general had embodied throughout his life. The sight of these symbols brought back memories of conversations Thomas had shared with his mentor about military tradition and the importance of ceremony in maintaining morale and unit cohesion. The service was conducted by the Dean of Westminster, who had known the general personally through various military chaplaincy programs. His opening words spoke of a life dedicated to service, not just to country, but to the individual soldiers who had served under the general's command and guidance. "We gathered today not just to mourn the passing of a distinguished military leader," the dean began, "but to celebrate a life that was devoted to developing the potential in others." General Worthington understood that true leadership meant creating more leaders, not more followers. Thomas felt these words deeply, knowing that they perfectly captured the essence of his relationship with the general. He remembered countless conversations where the general had pushed him to think independently, to develop his own leadership style, and to always consider how his actions affected those around him. The first reading was given by the general's eldest son, a civilian who worked as a teacher. His choice of passage from the Bible spoke about servants becoming leaders and leaders becoming servants. As he read, Thomas could see the general's influence in his son's bearing and values, even though the young man had chosen a different path from military service. During the hymns, Thomas was moved by the powerful voices of hundreds of mourners joining together. The military personnel sang with particular strength, their training and ceremonial duties evident in their unified voices. The hymn, "I Vow to Thee, My Country," seemed especially appropriate, as it had been one of the general's favorites during regimental ceremonies. The eulogy was delivered by Field Marshal Blackwood himself, who had managed to gain entry to the cathedral through military channels as he had promised. His speech was both personal and professional, sharing stories of the general's courage in combat situations and his dedication to soldier welfare during peacetime. Henry Worthington never forgot that behind every uniform was a human being with dreams, fears, and potential, the Field Marshal said. He made it his mission to help each soldier realize their best self, whether they served for 2 years or 20. As the Field Marshal spoke, Thomas noticed several people in the congregation wiping away tears. These weren't just formal expressions of respect, but genuine emotions from people whose lives had been touched by the general's kindness and guidance. The Field Marshal then did something unexpected. He looked directly at Thomas as he continued his eulogy. Henry's greatest pride wasn't in his own achievements, but in seeing the soldiers he mentored succeed in their chosen paths. He often told me that the true measure of a leader wasn't the battles won, but the lives changed for the better. Thomas felt a lump in his throat, understanding that the field marshal was acknowledging not just his presence, but the broader meaning of what had happened outside the cathedral. The intervention that had allowed Thomas to attend wasn't just about one soldier's desire to pay respects. It was about honoring the general's entire philosophy of military service. The ceremony included testimonials from soldiers of various ranks who had served under the general's command. A young lieutenant spoke about how the general had helped her overcome self-doubt during officer training. A sergeant major shared how the general's counseling had helped him through personal difficulties that could have ended his career. Each story illustrated different aspects of the general's character and his commitment to the welfare of those who served. When it came time for the military honors, Thomas stood with the rest of the congregation as the honor guard performed the traditional rifle salute. The sharp crack of the rifles echoed through the cathedral, followed by the haunting notes of "The Last Post" played by a lone bugler. The sound seemed to carry all the grief, respect, and gratitude that words couldn't express. During this moment, Thomas caught sight of Colonel Davies, who had also managed to gain entry to the ceremony. The elderly veteran stood ramrod straight despite his age, his hand raised in a perfect salute. Near him, Thomas could see other soldiers whose faces showed the same mixture of sadness and pride that he felt. The final blessing was followed by the recession of the honor guard, who would escort the general's casket to its final resting place. As the military procession prepared to leave the cathedral, Thomas felt a profound sense of completion. Despite all the morning's difficulties, he had been able to participate in this important farewell. As mourners began to file out of the cathedral, many of them paused to speak with one another about their memories of the general. Thomas found himself in conversations with soldiers he had never met, but who shared similar stories of the general's mentorship and support. One conversation particularly struck him. A young woman in an RAF uniform approached him and said, "I heard about what happened outside with your invitation. The general would have been proud of how the military family came together to make sure you were here." Another soldier, an older man with the bearing of a career non-commissioned officer, added, "That's exactly the kind of brotherhood the general always talked about, taking care of each other, especially when it matters most." These interactions reinforced for Thomas that the morning's events had been about much more than just his individual situation. They had been a demonstration of the values and traditions that the general had spent his career promoting. As Thomas emerged from Westminster Cathedral into the afternoon sunlight, he felt a profound sense of closure and gratitude. The ceremony had been everything he had hoped it would be, a fitting tribute to a man who had dedicated his life to serving others and developing military leaders of character. Outside the cathedral, mourners gathered in small groups sharing final thoughts and memories before departing. The formal atmosphere of the ceremony gave way to more personal conversations as people processed their emotions and reflected on the general's impact on their lives. Field Marshal Blackwood approached Thomas with a warm smile. "Sergeant Mitchell, I trust the ceremony met your expectations?" "Sir, it was perfect," Thomas replied with sincere gratitude. "I cannot thank you enough for making it possible for me to attend. Your kindness will never be forgotten." "The kindness was mutual," the Field Marshal responded. "You reminded me of something important today. Sometimes rigid adherence to protocol can prevent us from doing what's right." General Worthington would have appreciated the lesson. Colonel Davies joined them, walking slowly but with dignity. Despite his age, the morning's events seemed to have energized him. "Gentlemen, I believe we witnessed something special today, both inside and outside this cathedral." The colonel was right. The events of the morning had demonstrated that the values the general had championed, loyalty, honor, taking care of fellow soldiers, were alive and well in the military community. The intervention that had allowed Thomas to attend the funeral hadn't been about bending rules for convenience, but about upholding the deeper principles that those rules were meant to serve. As they talked, Officer Harrison approached the group with a somewhat sheepish expression. "Field Marshal Sergeant Mitchell, I wanted to apologize for the confusion this morning. After the ceremony, I received word from the ministry that there was indeed an administrative error in our invitation verification system. Several legitimate invitations were incorrectly flagged as potentially fraudulent." Harrison continued.
"It appears that a last-minute change in printing vendors resulted in slight variations in paper stock and formatting that weren't properly communicated to protocol staff.
Your invitation was completely legitimate, Sergeant. Thomas felt vindicated, but also understood that Harrison had simply been doing his job according to the information he had been given. No apology necessary, sir. You were following proper security protocols. I respect that. The Field Marshal nodded approvingly at Thomas's gracious response. That's the kind of character, General, Worthington valued in his soldiers, the ability to understand different perspectives and respond with maturity. Officer Harrison seemed relieved by Thomas's understanding attitude. If I may say so, sir, the way this situation was resolved today exemplified the best traditions of military leadership. The general would have been proud. As the various participants in the morning's drama prepared to go their separate ways, Thomas realized that the experience had taught him important lessons that went beyond simply being able to attend the funeral. He had witnessed leadership in action, seen how senior officers like Field Marshal Blackwood could make difficult decisions that upheld both protocol and principles. Colonel Davies shook Thomas's hand warmly. Son, I hope you'll stay in touch. I'd like to hear how your career progresses. Something tells me the general's mentorship will continue to bear fruit for years to come. I would be honored to stay in contact, Colonel, Thomas replied. Today has shown me how important it is for military generations to support each other. The Field Marshal had one final piece of advice for Thomas. Sergeant, as you continue your service, remember what happened here today. Remember that sometimes doing the right thing requires courage, whether you're a sergeant or a field marshal. The general believed in you and today proved he was right to do so. As Thomas walked back through the streets of London toward his barracks, he reflected on the extraordinary day. What had begun as a simple desire to attend his mentor's funeral had become a powerful lesson in leadership, military values, and the importance of standing up for what's right. He thought about how he might apply these lessons in his own military career. As a member of the Queen's Guard, he had always focused on the precision and discipline required for ceremonial duties. Today had shown him that true military service also required the courage to advocate for others and the wisdom to recognize when rules should serve principles rather than replace them. The invitation controversy, which had seemed so devastating at first, had ultimately led to something more valuable than simply attending the ceremony. It had demonstrated the power of military brotherhood and shown how leaders at all levels could work together to achieve what was right. Thomas began to understand why the general had spent so much time mentoring young soldiers. Each act of guidance and support created ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate relationship. The Field Marshal's intervention hadn't just helped Thomas attend a funeral. It had shown him what leadership looked like in practice. When Thomas arrived at his barracks, several of his fellow guardsmen were curious about how the funeral had gone. As he shared the story of the morning's events, he could see their reactions changing from initial amusement at the bureaucratic mix-up to genuine respect for the way senior officers had handled the situation. That Field Marshal sounds like a real leader, commented Corporal Williams, one of Thomas's colleagues. Not many officers would give up their own invitation like that. The general always said that true leaders create opportunities for others to succeed, Thomas replied. Today I saw that principle in action. Later that evening, Thomas sat down to write a letter to the general's widow, expressing his condolences and sharing how meaningful it had been to attend the funeral. He also wrote separate thank you notes to Field Marshal Blackwood and Colonel Davies, acknowledging their kindness and support. In his letter to the Field Marshal, Thomas wrote, Your intervention today taught me more about leadership than months of training manuals could have accomplished. You demonstrated that real authority comes from doing what's right, not just what's expedient. The experience also prompted Thomas to think about his own future in ways the general had always encouraged. Perhaps it was time to consider applying for a commission, to move from the ceremonial side of military service to positions where he could make the kind of difference the general had made in so many lives. Over the following weeks, Thomas found himself sharing the story with other soldiers, particularly younger ones who were struggling with their own challenges. He began to understand that mentorship wasn't just something that happened between senior and junior officers. It was something that could happen at any level when someone cared enough to invest in another person's success. The general's influence had extended beyond his own lifetime through the actions of those he had mentored. Field Marshal Blackwood had honored that legacy by ensuring Thomas could attend the funeral, and Thomas was now carrying forward the same spirit of support and guidance with his own colleagues. 3 months after the funeral, Thomas received an unexpected phone call. It was Field Marshal Blackwood's aide, informing him that the Field Marshal had recommended Thomas for a special leadership development program. The program was designed for promising non-commissioned officers who showed potential for greater responsibility. The Field Marshal mentioned that you demonstrated exceptional character during a difficult situation, the aide explained. He believes you have the qualities needed for expanded leadership roles. Thomas was honored by the recommendation, but also understood its deeper significance. This was how military mentorship worked, each generation of leaders identifying and developing the next, creating an unbroken chain of service and values. As Thomas prepared for the leadership program, he thought often about the general's final lesson, delivered not through words but through the events of his funeral day. The lesson was that military service at its best was about much more than following orders or completing missions. It was about creating communities of mutual support, about using authority to lift others up, and about ensuring that the values of honor and loyalty were passed down through actions as much as through words. The Royal Guard who had been denied entry to his mentor's funeral had ultimately received something more valuable than a seat in the cathedral. He had witnessed leadership in action, experienced the power of military brotherhood, and learned lessons that would guide his own career for years to come. The general's influence lived on, multiplied through the actions of all those whose lives he had touched.